Hi, we continue in Genesis 22 today as Abraham takes the wood for the burnt offering and puts it on his son Isaac. If you haven't watched the previous videos, both the introduction to Genesis 22 and the two videos on the first 5 verses, I really encourage you to do that before you watch this one. Of all the stories in Genesis, one is most important to read in its context, really of the wider context of the entire story of Abraham, back to chapter 12, but especially these last 3 chapters, Genesis 20 to 22, which many scholars don't recognize are tightly bound together, regardless of what source critics might say of the different chapters and different scenes coming from different times and different authors. They've been tightly integrated into this narrative we have here. And understanding what's going on in the story really depends upon our understanding where Abraham is and what's in his mind from the previous couple of chapters, both around Ishmael and Hagar and also around his relationship with Abimelech. But now we're about to proceed into the first of these two chiasms you can see on the right side of the screen that are both little ABA chiasms, and both have a center that's very similar around the question of God will provide for the burnt offering. And so as we continue, we also see some key words in this passage, and a number of those key words make this chiasm especially noticeable, and we'll see that a couple of words are used only in these passages and plainly making them into a chiastic parallel. And so we see the underlined words here are the ones that are chiastically parallel, and the colored ones are the ones that are key words in the passage. So we see the putting it on and putting on him, same word there. So the two of them walked on together, identical there, and the question of the knife on each side, as well as the question of the wood on each side, which again isn't mentioned again as we see in the second chiasm. So tightly put together here and full of emotion that's almost beyond words. The poignancy and the suffering that readers might have in their mind or Abraham might have in his mind, and we don't know what's in Isaac's mind, as we see them have the only reported conversation in their entire relationship in these couple of verses here. So it begins here. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering. And we had noted previously, as Middleton had pointed out, why carry the wood this whole way? Why not just get the wood at the site of the sacrifice? But he took it. And then why not leave it on the donkey and take the donkey with them? If they were concerned about the young men reporting what might happen back to Sarah, well, the donkey's not going to report. But he leaves the donkey behind and puts the wood of the burnt offering, takes it and literally put it on his son Isaac. And the great irony is, we'll see in a couple of verses, then he puts his son on the wood. So first he puts the wood on his son, and then he puts his son on the wood. And as we saw in verse 3, we see here again in verse 6, and it happens again in verse 9, the phrase his son Isaac is surrounded by Abraham doing things. So took the wood and put it on there, and then literally also took in his hand the fire and the knife. So not as many here. We'll see in verse 9 it matches verse 3 with 3 actions on either side of Isaac. So throughout the story, Isaac is surrounded by his father doing things that he has to try to figure out what's going on. And as we noted in the previous videos, it's not clear at all how old Isaac is. Rabbinic Midrash positions him from being a teenager to being 37, but the text simply doesn't say. And so we have to try to imagine, just like we did with Ishmael in that scene, where Hagar treated him at one level like he was a young toddler, but when we calculated based on the text that he was probably 17, here is Isaac a young man, or is he a middle-aged man? As some have noted based on the age of Sarah, that he would be 37, since Sarah is described as dying at 127 right after this scene. But we just don't know. And so what his response is to any of this, we only find out in this next verse. So Abraham is described as carrying the fire, and some have suggested, as Sarna below suggests, fire stone, since, as he says, it is considered unlikely that a flame would be carried for 3 days. But maybe, and as the cover image I put on this video here shows, you could carry it in a censer, and there's no reason you couldn't take that with you, and certainly people did. So Abraham is carrying the fire and the knife. And the word for knife here, makelet, is a word play on Moloch, angel, who will come in later, and it's only here in verse 10. So we see it here, and we see it here, making this chiasm. And it's not just an ordinary knife. And as it's noted here, a large and heavy implement is intended, and not an ordinary knife. A knife for cutting up an animal for a sacrifice, not just for cutting up your dinner. And then we have perhaps the most poignant phrase of all, and it frames the chiasm here, repeated verbatim. So the two of them walked on together. It certainly underscores the closeness of the father and son apart from the rest of the world. Sarah, not even mentioned, the two young men left behind, and of course Ishmael and Hagar, as far as Abraham knows, sent out into the wilderness to die. But the word for together here, Yakadav, here has a very interesting history throughout the book of Genesis. It was used twice in chapter 13 around the image of Lot. Let's look back there, of going together. Here, the land could not support both of them, that is Lot and Abraham, living together. So their togetherness meant they had to separate, and it's mentioned twice here, living together. They could not live together. And similarly with Isaac and Jacob here, for their possessions were too great for them to live together. The land where they were staying could not support them because of their livestock, so Esau settled in the hill country, just as Lot settles in the well-watered plain. So the other times in Genesis that the word for together is used, it's meant, perhaps ironically, to say no, not together. Abraham and his nephew are not together, and Jacob and Esau are not together. Here, father and son are together, perhaps for the purpose of killing one of them. But if you watch the previous videos, you know that contrary to most assumptions, the verb that is translated in the New RSV and in most translations as offer your son as a burnt offering can mean simply bring him up for a burnt offering, which is to say not make him the victim, the sacrifice itself, but carry him along, like introduce him to adulthood, introduce him to me, Yahweh perhaps, have him be someone who is part of this sequence so that I can know that I'm right, I got him right in saying that the covenant will continue through your lineage, not through Ishmael, but through Isaac. And so perhaps it's also a test of that. So we don't know yet whether he's going to kill Isaac or not, or whether that's in his mind. We really don't find that out until the end of this immediate scene here. So the two of them walk on together, and we don't know what's on Abraham's mind or not. And that's important as this little mini dialogue unfolds here. As my note below says, the Midrash tells a story of Samael, the evil angel, challenging Abraham and Isaac on whether this can really be from God there. And that's fitting with the sense that the Midrash already early on questioned whether Abraham was really being asked by God to kill his son. So Isaac said to his father, and the word for to say here, Vaimer, and said, is 4 times in this verse. So it's emphasizing the dialogue that's going on, even as simple as it is and as few words as it really is. Isaac said to his father Abraham, and notice that's echoing around here, the son Isaac, repeated so many times. He said to his father Abraham, Father. And notice it makes a little chiasm, just as it does in the Hebrew there, Father Abraham, Father, highlighting his role as the father of Isaac. And he said, Here I am, my son, Hineni, echoing exactly what he did when God called him and said, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. My son here, recalling 21:10, let's go back and look at that briefly. So this is Sarah saying to Abraham, Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with my son. So the question is the women's relationship with the son, but here Abraham is claiming my son. And that's again part of the subtext that we've been seeing around the Abimelech question, whether Abraham knows whether he actually is the biological father of Isaac, or whether he still suspects that perhaps Abimelech is, when Abimelech called Abraham to swear that he would treat what Abimelech called my son, Abimelech's son, with chesed, with the kind of loyalty and kindness and mercy which Abimelech claimed to offer Abraham in giving back Sarah and giving him all the presents afterward. So, here I am, my son. And he said, this is Isaac, of course, the fire and the wood are here, hine again, so the same word as here I am, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? As White notes below, Isaac does not note the presence of the knife. The elided reference to the knife thus comes to be a sign of the unspoken fear now coursing beneath the discourse of the father and the son. So when he mentions the fire and the wood, he doesn't mention that. Why lamb? Why should he assume the lamb is the burnt offering? He's only heard of a lamb once before. We heard of ewe lambs, the 7 ewe lambs that Abraham gave to Abimelech. And the only other lamb will be one of the lambs when Jacob and Laban are playing a little game over colored sheep and lambs later. But this is the only time we hear of a lamb for a burnt offering. And of course, the New Testament makes a lot of that, both in the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation, when Jesus is called the Lamb of God. But in fact, there is no lamb in this story, one way or another. In the end, it'll be a ram, not a lamb. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And scholars have largely assumed, and other interpreters, based on not catching the double meaning of the original invitation from God to either offer up Isaac or to bring him up, that Abraham is lying here. But there's an ambiguity in the response that suggests maybe he's lying and maybe he's not. Because I pointed out many times throughout this series, in the series on Samuel, biblical Hebrew has no punctuation, has no vowels, has no capitalization, has no spaces. And the comma here is a big deal. Because when we read it simply with words, we hear the ambiguity. God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And obviously you can hear that he's either saying, I'm speaking to you, my son, or the lamb for the burnt offering is you, my son. And we just simply don't know whether Abraham believes that God will simply provide an animal or whether God will provide the son. And we just have to wait in suspense here to see what's happening. And the narrator continues to build the suspense by repeating the phrase, so the two of them walked on together. And I want to pause for this as the narrator does, just to imagine what's going on here. Because this is a 3-day journey. And they're not just the two of them for the 3 days. It was on the third day they left the young men and the donkey behind. But still, how long is this journey if they're walking on together with Isaac bearing the wood on his back and Abraham carrying the fire and the knife? Finally, they come to the place, and we see in verse 9, I'll move it up so we can see verse 9 and 10, again as we saw in verse 3, that Isaac, here the son Isaac is surrounded by 3 actions on either side of the father. Abraham built, laid, and bound, and then laid, reached, and took. And Isaac is there in the middle. When they came to the place that God had shown him, which we heard earlier, but we still don't know how that happened. And notice we know nothing about the place. We hear the word place again, and that's one of our key words. But we don't know what that place is, other than it's a place called Moriah. Abraham built an altar there, and that recalls his earlier altars built where there was not sacrifice. There's just building of an altar back in chapter 12, verse 8, and in chapter 13. Built an altar there, and using the word sham there, which is used many times in Genesis, especially in the Tower of Babel stories, a play on words. But notice all the emphasis on a place that we don't know what it is. The place that God showed him, an altar there, and yet we don't know the place. And so he built the altar and put the wood in order here, or actually laid it here. It's a different word than the earlier word that's translated laid, which is simply put, and it's only in 14:8 elsewhere in Genesis. He laid the wood in order is not in the Masoretic or the Septuagint, so that's being provided. So he simply built an altar and laid the wood, and now we get to his moment of decision. It's only now that we hear he bound his son Isaac. And that's the word from which we get the Hebrew name of the story, the Akedah, from the root here, Akkad. And if folks want to follow legal provisions, like in Leviticus 1, the procedure for a burnt offering doesn't specify binding, and the animal is normally slaughtered before laying on the altar. But that's not what Abraham's doing here, and he's not doing this in response to Leviticus 1. He's doing it in response to a unique command, which he seems to have misunderstood. Now, this is one of those places where we have to ask, how old do we imagine Isaac being? We know that Abraham was 100 when he was born, and so however old Isaac is, Abraham's 100 plus that. If he's the 37 that the rabbis have concluded, then he's a fully grown man with a very old father, who would not certainly be able to bind him against his will, which has led much of the Midrash to say that Isaac was in on this, that he agrees and that he worships God, even though it never says he does, and he's willing to go along with the father's plan here. And we might remember that when Isaac's intention is again raised when his wife, Rebekah, tells her beloved son Jacob to lie to their father Isaac and pretend to be Esau. And whether Isaac knows that that's Jacob pretending to be Esau or is in on the plan, we'll have to wait until we see that scene. But perhaps this experience is a little bit behind that scene as well, and we'll get there when we get there. So he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And we hear the great irony is that on the trip getting to this place, the wood was put on Isaac, and now Isaac's put on the wood, literally above the wood. Although the lexicon notes that the word here, ma'al, has another meaning to be unfaithful or treacherous act. Although in the earlier times here in the ark description, it simply means above, like it would here, above the wood or on top of the wood. And so whether Hebrew literate readers would hear that darker subtext, I'm not sure. But then it happens. We get to the key verse 10 here. And as my note from White below has it, is Abraham's willingness to, quote, sacrifice the material embodiment of his spiritual values that allows the narrative to continue. Isaac and his generation cannot receive the promise by mere biological and cultural processes, but through a new divine disclosure. In making this choice for a, quote, pure spirituality, that is, one deprived of the material expression of the promise, his character is closed as one who fears God. And that's certainly one way to read it, but as I'm going to continue through the story in this and the following videos, perhaps there's another subtext, a double meaning of this beyond that. So Abraham reached out his hand, and many artists have pictured this terrible moment here, reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. And we only hear the word kill here one other time in Genesis, and that's when the brothers use a goat to substitute for Joseph to put the blood on his many-colored coat, really a long-sleeve coat, to fool their father into thinking that it was Joseph that was dead, not the goat. No DNA test to see whose blood it was. And so we hear the parallel there. There's an animal substituted for a beloved son. And so we will stop there in that incredibly poignant moment before we get to the next chiasm, when the angel of the Lord calls, "Don't do it." See you then.